Will Israel attack Iran? Its military says it's preparing plans, and the Israeli government is urging the new U.S. administration not to rejoin the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. So is this a real threat, or as Tehran calls it, psychological war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahalbarra. Israel has warned it's revising its plans for a possible military attack against Iran, but Tehran has dismissed it. The Iranian presidential chief of staff says comments by Israel's top army general are psychological war, but his nation is ready to defend itself. Israel has long accused the Iranians of wanting to develop a nuclear bomb and put Israel's security at risk. Tehran denies the allegations and maintains its energy program is for peaceful purposes. It's urging the new U.S. administration to rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal that limits Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. President Joe Biden has shown readiness to rejoin the accord, but with a caveat. We'll get to that shortly. First, let's listen to what the Israeli and Iranian officials had to say.
I have instructed the IDF to prepare several operational plans in addition to existing ones, which we will develop throughout the coming year. The power to initiate them lies with the political echelon. However, the offensive options need to be prepared, ready, and on the table.
They just talk. They are leading a psychological warfare and have practically no plan, no capacity, and are not able to start a war. Our armed forces are trained to defend Iran. The different maneuvers that we have done are signs that we do not intend to attack nor go to war, but that we are serious in defending our country.
Israel's military chief has warned a U.S. return to the Iran nuclear deal would be a mistake.
Even if there's a similar agreement with a few improvements, it is operationally and strategically wrong. It's operationally wrong because it will again allow at its end or even beforehand Iran to enrich uranium, to develop centrifuges, to develop even the capabilities of the weapons until developing a bomb.
Iran scaled down its commitments to the 2015 deal after former President Donald Trump abandoned it nearly 3 years ago. Tensions have since grown between Washington and Tehran, especially since Trump reimposed sanctions. But the new U.S. Secretary of State says one of the top priorities for President Joe Biden is the relationship with Iran. Antony Blinken says Washington will return to the accord if Iran does its part.
If Iran comes back into full compliance with its obligations under the JCPOA. The United States would do the same thing. And then we would use that as a platform to build with our allies and partners what we call a longer and stronger agreement, and to deal with a number of other issues that are deeply problematic in the relationship with Iran. But we are a long ways from that point. Iran is out of compliance on a number of fronts, and it would take some time, should it make the decision to do so, for it to come back into compliance, and time for us then to assess whether it was meeting its obligations. So we're not there yet, to say the least.
Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has responded to Blinken's remarks. He said the U.S. violated the Iran deal and caused harm to its population through reimposed sanctions. Zarif said Tehran had been abiding by the deal and had sought remedial measures, and finally stressed the country will never forget what he called Trump's maximum failure towards Iran. Let's bring in our panel in West Jerusalem. We have Mitchell Barak. He is a pollster at Kivon Global Research and former spokesman for Israeli President Shimon Peres. In Tehran, Ali Akbar Darini, a researcher at the Center for Strategic Studies, a government-affiliated think tank. Washington, D.C., Hilary Mann Leverett. She's the CEO of the consulting firm Stratega and a former director for Afghanistan, Iran, and Persian Gulf Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council. Welcome to you all. Mitchell, when a top Israeli military commander criticizes U.S. foreign policy, particularly this aspect about Iran, is this an individual stance, or is he reflecting the whole sentiment across the political spectrum in Israel?
Well, I would say that the political spectrum in Israel is concerned with it. We've done some polling actually across the region, including in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. Iran is not a really big threat for people there. Even in Israel, it's a concern for the leadership in Israel. I don't know why the military head would come out now with this, especially with the new administration, where we don't know how they stand on some of these issues. But I have a feeling it was coordinated, obviously, with the Prime Minister's office to kind of now put pressure on the new Biden administration to make sure if there is going to be a new agreement with the Iranians, or they're going to open up the old agreement, that Israel takes it very seriously. Israel is very concerned with both the rhetoric and the capability of this Iranian regime, which seems to be still supporting terror and threatening with Israel's destruction.
Ali, what is interesting about the statement by the Israel's army chief of staff is basically he's not only critical of the 2015 nuclear deal, he's also expressing a sentiment which is opposed to any possible improved version of that particular deal in the near future. How is that seen in Iran?
Israel is a fierce opponent of the JCPOA. Iran considers Israel as a spoiler. The Netanyahu government has worked hard in the past years under the Trump administration to destroy the JCPOA. And now, with Biden taking office, Israel's policy is to pressure the Biden administration to include Israel's concerns and Israel's attitude while it is going to discuss the nuclear issue with Iran. So whether this is, to measure the Biden administration's efforts to save the nuclear deal will entirely depend on his efforts to distance from the Trump administration. So de-Trumpization of America will be a key element to measure the Biden administration's success or failure. The more it distances from coercive measures and returns to dialogue, the more likely it is to save the nuclear deal.
All right.
The Americans now admit that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed. So now there is a golden opportunity for the Biden administration to save this nuclear deal now.
Hillary, you've just listened to what Ali Akbardari has been saying. Basically, this is exactly what the Iranian president has been saying, what his inner circle has been saying, and what the Iranian foreign minister has been saying. They're expecting Joe Biden to distance himself from Trump's legacy and move forward. But do you think that it is going to be an easy task for Joe Biden to say, you know what, let's just reactivate the 2015 nuclear deal?
Well, I actually think it could be incredibly easy. As Iran's foreign minister has said, it would take maybe 3 executive orders. It could take President Biden 5 minutes to go back to the place the United States was when Trump cut off the United States from the nuclear deal. And what the position the United States was in at that point was essentially just issuing waivers to existing sanctions. We weren't lifting sanctions. Sanctions weren't lifted. We were just issuing waivers. And those waivers had to renew every 4 to 6 months. So that's something that Biden could easily do literally within 5 to 10 minutes. But the question is whether he wants to and whether his staff wants him to. There's real division within the Biden administration already. And between the Biden administration and the Senate, the U.S. Senate is a body that President Biden spent nearly 30 years of his life in, and he values it as a real partner in terms of U.S. policy. And in the Senate, the 2 most powerful people who would have influence over the Iran issue are the new Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, and the new head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chairman Menendez. Those two both voted against the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015. They have never been supporters of the Iran nuclear deal. So Biden knows that he does not have the Senate behind him if he were to quickly go back into the nuclear deal. And then within the Biden administration itself, there are some real divisions. We saw the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, yesterday really pour water on the Iranians' attempts to say that there's a limited window of opportunity to rejoin the JCPOA, and the United States needs to act fast. Blinken said, no, we're not going to act fast. The United States is basically happy with the situation. Containment of Iran has been a long-time U.S. policy goal, and essentially the view within the Biden administration is that Iran is contained. However, there are also key members of the Biden administration who worked extremely hard on the Iran nuclear deal. This was the crowning achievement of their entire career. Someone like Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, the new head of the CIA, Bill Burns, and perhaps the new Iran envoy, if he is so chosen, Rob Malley. Those three figures believe very strongly in the Iran nuclear deal, engaging in Iran in what they would see broadly as a Biden reattachment of importance to a multipolar international order. But they're not the entire Biden administration. They're key figures, but Blinken, Jake Sullivan, others within the Senate, as I said, are against joining the nuclear deal right now as is.
Mitchell, that political reality, that very complex political reality that Hillary has been portraying about the U.S., different domestic agendas now. Does that explain the reason why we've seen many Israeli officials stepping in to try to play into that particular divide in the US and say, you know what, you have to be very careful when you are moving forward?
Well, I think Hillary had a very good point in that there are people in the Senate that voted against this. But it's not only a domestic issue anymore. You know, Israel was against this Iranian deal because they felt that there was no oversight, that the Iranians, you know, continued to enrich uranium, and certainly rhetoric. I mean, we found recently that words can lead to violence. You know, and there are people that think that President Trump encouraged people to go into the Capitol to, you know, have a kind of revolution, attack the Capitol. People were killed. He was closed out of Twitter and Facebook because words are very powerful. And we see the same rhetoric of genocide and Israel has no right to exist coming from the Iranian leaders for a long time. So this, from the Israeli perspective, also has to stop. And I think a lot of people will agree. Words have a possibility to cause violence. And when you back that up with the Iranian terror policy, that can be very fatal. But what has changed now, which is amazing, is before it was Israel coming to the table on their own, opposing it with a little bit of whispering and help from maybe some other Gulf Arab states. Now when Israel comes and opposes this, they're sitting next to Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Saudi Arabia is right there. Maybe Saudi Arabia is going to be on the side of Israel, but you have a real coalition here between Israel and these Gulf state countries that are going to go to the Biden administration and that are going to oppose this and be on Israeli side. So besides of all of Israel's friends in Washington, of which Joe Biden has been a friend of Israel for his 40 years in government, this is not like he just came into it. Yes, he was vice president during the Obama administration, but certainly his 36 years in Senate, a staunch supporter of Israel. We'll have to see where this plays out. But Israelis can rely on Joe Biden, that's for sure.
Ali, why would Iranians brush aside all those statements from Israeli officials as a psychological war when the Israeli chief of the army chief of staff is basically ordering fresh military plans to be taken into consideration? You know what that means? It means the possibility for a military strike against Iran.
Israel has been planning to carry out a strike against Iran for many years under their Begin doctrine. But Iran is a big country, and Israel is not in a position to carry out such an attack. That's exactly why they have failed so far to carry out their threats, because Iran's nuclear facilities are scattered all around the country. They are buried under mountains, and Iran has taken every measure necessary to protect its nuclear facilities. At the same time, it has increased its air defense power, and Iran is a power to be reckoned with. So,
yeah, but at the same time,
the Israeli threats.
but at the same time,
Israeli threat.
before I go to you,
invades your computer system and shuts down your country. So, it's nice to talk very big, but, do you think that Israel has a right to exist, Ali? Do you think that Israel has a right to exist, or are you going to keep going with that genocide policy? Where do you stand on Israel? I know Israel's not a threat to you. Where do you stand on Israel in the Middle East? Does Israel have a place in the Middle East?
Israel is considered an illegitimate entity based on occupation. But let me finish my answer first. If Israel was in a position to attack Iran, it would have carried out such an attack years ago. Israel has calculated that it cannot destroy Iran's nuclear facilities in a single successful military operation. And Iran will be in a position to respond decisively. That's exactly why Israel has refrained from carrying out such attacks. But Iran does know that Israel's strategy and third circle directorate within its military and intelligence apparatus under the Momentum Plan has been trying to plan a war against Iran. And Iran knows well how to respond. Iran has sufficient deterrence power to respond decisively to any Israeli military aggression.
Hillary, one of the biggest concerns voiced by the Israeli government and Israeli officials over the last few years about the 2015 nuclear deal is basically the sunset clauses. And they are concerned that this is something that could be conducive once the deal is finalized to provide Iran with a pathway to resume its nuclear capabilities and end up one day with the bomb.
Well, I served in the United States government for a very long time. I was in the first Bush administration back in 1991 when Israeli government officials, including Yitzhak Rabin at the time, first started to raise what they called the threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And Israelis have been raising it ever since. Before 1991, they didn't raise it because their concern was Iraq and Iraq's path to a nuclear weapon. But when Iraq was so soundly defeated in the after its invasion of Kuwait, that wasn't so much of a threat for the Israelis. And when Iraq was contained with oil for food sanctions that killed nearly 50,000 Iraqi children, the Israelis weren't so worried about Iraq. I think what the Israelis are really worried about is Iran's military might and its power, whether it's nuclear weapons or anything else. There are just some facts of geography and facts of population. Iran is a huge country with a large, educated, sophisticated population. That's always going to be a problem for a small country like Israel and for some of the small Gulf states like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Biden understands that. Biden does have a long history in dealing with the region, and he has a long and somewhat mixed relationship with the Israeli prime minister and some of the other leaders in the Gulf. So it's a complicated issue for Biden, but he does not take just at face value that from 1991 till today, that the Iranians have been trying to make nuclear weapons for 30 years, and they've been unable to do so, that all of a sudden today they're the big threat. I don't think that Biden or anyone in the administration agrees with that. But there are people in the Biden administration who share Israel's concern that under really any constellation, Iran, because of its geography, population, resources, that is always going to be a challenge to U.S. hegemony and U.S. power in the region. And of course, U.S. allies are going to be concerned about that. But it doesn't mean that there's a good pathway to break Iranian power in the same way we did with Iraq.
Mitchell, to what extent is Benjamin Netanyahu using Iran for his own political survival?
I mean, it's always, to a certain extent, about political survival. I mean, it came up yesterday. I think, we kind of missed it because it is International Holocaust Remembrance Day yesterday, January 27th. And for Israelis, the Holocaust was a past, present, and future event. I mean, just on this program, the gentleman from Tehran said, Israel is an illegitimate country. I mean, we're in the United Nations, we're the U.S. closest ally, but to him, it's an illegitimate country. That means in his mind and the mind of his leadership that it's okay to do anything else. We don't have the right to exist. And he comes with some false pretense about occupation. The occupation, if you want to use that, is from 1967. So if Israel, withdrew from the 67 boundaries, or from 1948 to 1967, was Israel legitimate in the eyes of the Iranians? No. I mean, the answer is no, because we have a very violent and belligerent group of people in Tehran who say that Israel has no right to exist. Now, it's very nice that they say Israel doesn't have the capability. We don't know what capabilities Israel has, and we don't know what capabilities the Iranians have. What we do know is that in order to make the world a safer place, Iran has to stop supporting terrorism in the region, meaning paying for it, providing cover. They have to stop the rhetoric against the state of Israel, that Israel is legitimate, we have no right to exist, all of these things. And they have to make sure, the world has to make sure that they don't get the weapons to carry out on their crazy plans of saying, this country is legitimate, this country is not legitimate, we can do it, we can change the world. It's unfortunate that in this day and age, we still have these kinds of attitudes.
For the sake of moving forward, Ali Akbar Darini, now you've been saying that the Israelis have been trying to put more pressure on the U.S. administration so as not to move forward with the 2015 agreement. But at the same time, you have Iran saying that it's enriching uranium to something like 20%, which is beyond the 3% that was stipulated under the JCPOA agreement, and that they are also beginning research into metal, uranium metal, which is a key component for manufacturing the bomb. Isn't Iran undermining the chance of moving forward towards a peaceful settlement to this whole problem?
No. Article 26 of the JCPOA says if sanctions are reintroduced or reimposed against Iran, Iran will consider it as its right to cease performing its commitments to the JCPOA in whole or in part. So Iran is implementing the same JCPOA signed with the powers. But at the same time, Iran is reducing its commitments to the JCPOA in order to be in a better negotiating position in the coming weeks. But I see that there is a political camp comprising various lobbyist groups in the U.S. Congress and in the Biden administration, including the Israeli lobby groups, that argue that simple U.S. return to the JCPOA is not enough. It's not it's not a good idea.
All right.
And they argue that this.
I have just one last question, if you don't mind. I'm going to Hillary. Hillary, the Israelis and those who were supporting the maximum pressure on Iran think it is efficient, it's been biting into the Iranian economy, and ultimately it will yield results. Others are saying, no, on the contrary, this is just going to drag the region into further instability and anarchy. You look at the map, key regional players vying for a bigger say. The EU is looking cautiously at what is going to happen in the near future. How do you see the future of the 2015 nuclear deal? Is it going to be triggered, reactivated under the same shape and form, or are we going to see something different this time?
I am concerned that the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA from 2015, I'm not optimistic that it can be resuscitated. I do not think there's enough support within the Biden administration and within the U.S. Congress for various reasons. They include the interests of lobbying groups. They include the interests of other countries like Israel and the Gulf states. But I think even more so for President Biden and for others, they are happy with the containment of Iran. Even though they criticized harshly Trump's policies, the one policy area that they came together basically to agree on was how he dealt with the Middle East. So there's a lot of support for that. And I think if the Biden administration rejoined the JCPOA, that would mean President Biden would have to go back to the Senate during his first term in office and get the U.S. Senate to lift all sanctions on Iran. That's not going to happen. That would set Biden up for failure, and I don't think he's going to go down that path.
It would be extremely interesting to see what happens next, who is going to take the first step, and what will the region look like in the near future. Mitchell, Barak, Ali Akbar, Darini, Hillary, Malevrit, thank you very much indeed for your insight. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahl Barra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.